Hey everyone, and thanks for jumping back into the Cryptoverse. Today, we're going to talk about Ethereum, but more specifically, we're going to talk about the Ether Bitcoin valuation and discuss the probabilities of a coming collapse. If you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up, and also check out the sale on Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. Let's go ahead and jump in. Before we get too far, I would like to say that this is just my opinion on the market. It is not meant to be financial advice. While I do sometimes get things right, I also sometimes get things wrong. So I would not advise anyone to necessarily take anything that I say to the bank because, again, they are not going to cash it in. With that said, my goal is to try and provide an unbiased view of the market as best I can. Whether I achieve that or not, I guess, is up for interpretation. But if you go back through the history of this channel, there you'll find phases where I'm bullish on the Ethereum Bitcoin valuation, phases where I'm bearish. For reference, the first video you'll see on my channel, I was quite bullish on the Ethereum Bitcoin valuation. We talked about timing the long-term momentum shifts back when it was at 0.02. But when we had the merge, I was quite bearish on the Ethereum Bitcoin valuation. I was also quite bearish on it over here as well, back in mid-2022. And we talked about the likelihood of this just being a secondary distribution phase. Now, we've come a long way since then. As you can see in this video, the Ethereum Bitcoin valuation was at 0.08. What I would like to draw your attention to in this video is the fact that the Bitcoin dominance was at 40%. And today, it sits at 51%. So this thesis of the rest of the market bleeding back to Bitcoin has, in fact, been coming true. Where it has not materialized in the same way, at least not yet, is in the Ethereum Bitcoin valuation. Now we know that the Ether Bitcoin valuation has gone down. As you can see in this video, it was sitting at around 0.08, and making this video right now, it's at 0.0627. So it has generally trended in the direction we would have expected since the merge. If you're not familiar with this view on a secondary distribution phase of the Ether Bitcoin valuation, it more or less looks familiar in terms of Bitcoin USD, right? And this is what we talked about back when we had the merge, is that, Bitcoin USD had this long distribution phase where you had sort of one distribution phase that had 4 peaks, sort of like a brief reaccumulation phase, followed by a secondary distribution phase that basically just had 2 peaks. That was the assessment that we made. And then we talked about how from that point, the Bitcoin USD valuation bled for a while, then popped back up, but then ultimately we ended up going to new lows. So in the context of that, the idea was, well, is Ether following the same distribution pattern on its Bitcoin pair? And I would argue that it back then I argued that it was, and I would still, even today, I would say, you know what, it still seems like that is what is playing out. It seems like what it's been playing out, and is probably going to be, in my opinion, is the most likely scenario to continue playing out. You essentially have your first distribution phase, your sort of brief reaccumulation window, and then your secondary distribution phase that just had sort of a 1-2 punch, just like we saw with Bitcoin USD. Now, since the merge, and we talked about this distribution phase, you can see that the Ethereum Bitcoin valuation has just been slowly bleeding. Now, where it becomes difficult for a lot of people, and including myself, because you have to defend these theories, and when you put these theories out there, and it maybe goes the wrong way in the short term, it can be difficult, and especially on each of these lower highs by the Ether Bitcoin valuation, there are a lot of critics. But I would remind people that literally every single move by Ether's Bitcoin valuation has been a lower high since the merge. So there is this idea that the changing tokenomics of Ethereum would make it immune to bleeding back to Bitcoin. And I've continued to argue that I do not think that is true. And I think if it were true, you would see higher Ether Bitcoin valuation since the merge. But the fact that it's been putting in lower highs, to me, continues to sort of support my idea, in my own mind anyways, that this is just a series of lower highs. It has also been a series of lower lows, right? We put in a new low on the Ether Bitcoin valuation since the merge as recently as just a week ago or so. So this thesis, in my opinion, continues to play out. It's just playing out in a very slow manner. Okay, it's going incredibly slow, but I will say again, like just because it's going slow doesn't mean it's not happening. And we should at least be cognizant of that fact, right? Just because it's not going down, 50% in a weekend doesn't mean that it's not bleeding. And you can see that it has been bleeding for quite some time. Now, one counterpoint that someone might try to make is that, well, is this a wedge that should be considered bullish, right? That might be a counterpoint that someone might try to make, the idea that it could actually bounce out back up this way. I will argue that anything is possible, and that's why I say you should not take this necessarily to the bank. Be that as it may, we actually had a somewhat similar pattern back over here. If you remember, the Ethereum Bitcoin valuation was also following a very similar pattern back over here in the last cycle, where it was putting in these lower highs and slightly lower lows. Now, it did not last as long as it has this time, but it was still a very familiar pattern, right? And it ended up breaking to the downside, even though a lot of people thought it would have broken back up. Very similar pattern. Interestingly enough, this level here, this 0.05 level, is more or less where the Ether Bitcoin valuation bounced off of, right? If you were to go look at this bounce here, you can see that's also where the Ethereum Bitcoin valuation bounced over here before going into this sort of secondary distribution phase, which ended up being nothing more than a lower high, right? Like this was a lower high compared to this one back over here. Just like this was a lower high compared to this one. And there was also an even higher high back even further. So I can't help but think that there is a decent probability that the thesis is still sound. It's just taking place over a long time period. Now, one justification or rationalization of this could be along the lines or the idea that there's just more excess liquidity in this business cycle than there was in the last one. And maybe that's why it's taking a longer period of time for this ultimately to come to fruition. But I would still argue that it is still happening, whether it's happening as quickly as some people might want it to, obviously is up for debate, but it is still happening. Okay. Now, something we talked about as well are the monthly Heikin-Ashi candles of the Ether Bitcoin valuation. And they actually are kind of interesting to me because, we've talked about this long-term pattern of the Ether Bitcoin valuation where you sort of get your initial distribution followed by brief reaccumulation into your sort of your real distribution phase and then your secondary distribution phase, right? So you have your 1, 2, 3, and 4. Arguably, this was 1, and then this was your sort of reaccumulation, 2, 3, and 4. So I would argue that, we're just sort of following this same type of pattern, just like we did last cycle, right? And so the argument is, well, when is this actually going to break down? And what would actually cause it to break down? If you remember, one of the things that I've said time and time again is that during this stage of the cycle, the purpose of Bitcoin USD pumps is to break the altcoin market down on their Bitcoin pairs so that when Bitcoin USD dumps, the altcoin market has nowhere to hide. They would have lost their pivot points in a Bitcoin USD pump because they struggle to catch a bid. But then when Bitcoin rolls back over and goes back below the 20-week SMA, those altcoins have no real ability, at least for the most part, collectively. Doesn't mean there's not a few that outperform, but for the most part, they have no real ability to catch a bid because they are much further along the risk curve. And as liquidity dries up, we know that the riskier assets get hit the quickest and the hardest, right? We've seen this play out time and time again. So that might raise the question in your own mind, well, what was it that caused the Ether Bitcoin valuation to drop over here, right? Like, why did it drop? What broke it off of this support? Because for a long time, we were holding this sort of wedge as well, right? And it would have been argued as a potential bullish pattern by some, I imagine, but it ended up breaking to the downside rather than the upside. This breakdown of Ether Bitcoin did not initially come on a Bitcoin USD dump, although it was followed through with a Bitcoin USD dump a few months later, or even just a few weeks later. Where it actually started was from a Bitcoin USD pump, right? It was this pump right here by Bitcoin USD that knocked the Ether Bitcoin valuation off of its support. So that then when Bitcoin USD came back down, the Ethereum Bitcoin valuation just simply had nowhere to hide. And you can see that the Ethereum Bitcoin valuation went down during a Bitcoin pump and it went down during a Bitcoin dump. It did both. And that was wherein lies the thesis of the dominance of Bitcoin ultimately heading higher. Now, one interesting aspect or one argument about that I see people talk about with the Bitcoin dominance is that there's no way it's going to go to 60%, which has been my general view for quite a long period of time, is that it should find its way, to that 60% level before this is all said and done. Now, it's currently sitting at 51%. Now, remember, in this video over here, the idea of going to 60% seemed like a foreign concept to many. That was when the dominance was at 40%. Now it's at 51%, and a lot of people are still fighting this idea and trying to figure out, well, where is the rest of this dominance rally going to come from? I would argue that a large part of it could in fact come from Ethereum. If you look at the Ethereum dominance, it's actually around 20% or so, right? It's around 20%. This is essentially the same levels that it actually dumped at from that point that we just looked at, right? When we looked back at the Ethereum Bitcoin valuation in 2018, that wedge, where did it break down from when Bitcoin USD pumped? It broke down from around these levels, right? I mean, it was essentially the same level almost that it actually broke down from. I'm not suggesting that it has to go all the way back down here, although it could, but I am suggesting that at the very least, we should see it break back down to these levels. Now, if the Ethereum dominance were to go down, say, 10%, and it goes back to, say, Bitcoin or somewhere else, you could easily get another 5 or 6% tacked onto the Bitcoin dominance just from the Ethereum valuation alone. So I would say that the altcoin reckoning is likely not over until we see the collapse of the Ethereum Bitcoin valuation. Now, one interesting thing, if you go look at Ether Bitcoin, it was this collapse, right, that sort of marked the end, right? It was revisiting the prior low. And that was where altcoins finally started to catch a bid on their USD pairs, was when Ethereum's Bitcoin valuation revisited this mark here. And it happened approximately a year later, about a year later. So the argument, of course, is, well, what if this is similar to this? And perhaps altcoins can finally catch a bid when the Ethereum Bitcoin valuation returns to these levels. I don't know. I mean, this is one potential idea. I'm not necessarily standing by that idea right now because I do actually think the Ethereum Bitcoin valuation will eventually break lower, just like it did back over here, right? I mean, it might come back down to this level, bounce back up, and then eventually roll back over, maybe into the halving year. But there's this idea that the Ethereum Bitcoin valuation should head back to this 0.04 to 0.05 level, maybe bounce a little bit, and then go to the 0.03 to 0.04 level before it can really find a low. And that has been my view for a long time, and it will still continue to be my view until proven otherwise. And, I don't exactly, because people say, well, what's the invalidation? Well, how can we invalidate it when it's playing out just on a very slow time frame, right? I mean, if the Ethereum Bitcoin valuation were just continuing to trend up, right? I mean, if it were trending up like this, like it did back over here, if it were trending up, then perhaps I'd be willing to throw in the towel on it, but it's not, right? Like it's just been trending down in a very similar fashion that we've seen in the past. Very similar patterns that we've seen in the past. Furthermore, one idea is that why look at the Ethereum Bitcoin valuation at all? Because it doesn't account for the supply. The supply is not constant, right? We know that. I mean, Ethereum used to be quite inflationary. Now it's deflationary, and it's actually this deflationary view that make a lot of people think that it won't go down against Bitcoin. But then I say, well, why is it going down against Bitcoin if the tokenomics matter so much? It is still going down, not as quickly, but it is still going down. If If you look at the Ethereum Bitcoin market cap ratios, you get something that looks like this. And, is it an oscillator? I don't know. I mean, it could be. And if it is, then it could come back down here. Even if it's not an oscillator, maybe it comes back down to the 0.25 level, like where it retraces half of the move, which is, I think you could make a compelling case that could be the low on it. But we're still in this phase where I think that whether Ethereum's Bitcoin valuation will break higher in the next cycle or not, we still are likely to see it go down in the short to medium term. Now, will it go up tomorrow or next week? I don't know. Oftentimes it will, just to make people, criticize the theory even more. But then again, you zoom out, you come back a few weeks later, and oftentimes it's just putting in new lows again. It's a lower high and a lower low. So I expect this to continue to play out. Another way to look at this is another interesting way to maybe look at this, is to look at month or yearly candles, right? So if you were to look at 2018 and 2019, in 2018, Ethereum Bitcoin had quite a long wick. And then the next yearly candle had a yearly close below where this wick was. So I'm arguing that this yearly close on the Ethereum Bitcoin valuation could easily be below this wick. This wick was at 0.049. I'm saying that I would not be surprised to see a yearly close by Ether Bitcoin in the 0.03 to 0.04 range. And from there, it might start to finally build out a more sustained base. Again, people can think all they want, but look at yearly candles, right? Negative 9% last year. So far, it's negative 13%. But if we take out the prior low over here, like we did back over here in the pre-halving year of 2019, then from this level, you're looking at another 21% drop against the Ether Bitcoin on the Ether Bitcoin pair. And it could easily go down to another 40% drop on the Ether Bitcoin pair. This might not sound like a compelling case, but remember, in the pre-halving year of 2019, Ether USD closed below its yearly open, right? I mean, you can see here it closed at around 0.09 or something. So it closed below its yearly open. Look at the Ether Bitcoin valuation in the pre-halving year, 2019. Look at what Ether Bitcoin did in 2019, and then look at what it's doing in 2023. It's not an exact copy, admittedly, but it's not that dissimilar either, right? It's not. And so I guess the argument is, well, is it going to continue to follow this? And I'd say there's a decent chance that it does, right? Where it continues to go lower. Now, from a seasonality perspective, we're in the phase where Ether Bitcoin tends to bleed. We talked about this in the prior videos on Ethereum Bitcoin, where I said the last stand could easily come in May, right? Where it gets this lower high yet again. And it was a lower high. I mean, again, if you look at all these peaks, right, this was this level here was 07093. This one here was 07088, right? So it technically was a lower high compared to this one as well. They've all been lower highs. And I said that I think maybe going into the first or second week of June, could be the last stand for the Ethereum Bitcoin valuation before we get into this seasonality where Ether Bitcoin tends to bleed. And I said I expect June to be red, and it was. I expect July to be red, and it is so far. We'll see where it ends up turning out at the end of the month. You can see that on average, the Ether Bitcoin return in June is negative 7.6%. What did we get in June? Negative 7.78. On average in July, the loss of Ether Bitcoin is around 4% to the downside. What are we at so far? Negative 1%. But on average, Ether Bitcoin is green in the first 5 months of the year and red in the seven months to follow. The standard deviations are high. You can get some months that are green. Last July for Ether Bitcoin was green, right? It was. We also had the merge. I think that hype led to that renewed interest. But I don't see that same renewed hype today, and so I would argue that it's less likely for Ether Bitcoin to go up, 33% this month like it did last year. I think it's more likely that it'll follow the pre-halving years. And by the way, the pre-halving year 2019 saw Ether Bitcoin drop 19% in July. In July, a 19% drop by Bitcoin or by the Ether Bitcoin valuation in July would put it. Let me go to the monthly candle so I can actually get it from this month. It would put it all the way down at around 0.05, so near the prior low. So how does Ether Bitcoin break off its support, right? Like, I mean, it last cycle, it took a Bitcoin pump to break it off its support. You could see the same thing play out this time as well, right? I mean, if you go look at Bitcoin USD, what you'll see in the pre-halving years of 2011, 2015, 2019, and 2023 is that we often find some type of a yearly high or a significant local high before maybe a revisit to the lows around the summertime, June or July. So in 2015, it occurred on day 193. In 2019, it occurred on day 177. In 2011, it was on day 161. We're currently on day 185. So Bitcoin is entering into that season where it could roll over, but just because it rolls over doesn't mean it can't go up first, right? Like, it could go up first. In fact, if you were to average out, just say the last two pre-halving years for Bitcoin and overlay it on the chart, and let's just get rid of everything else so that we can look at it a little bit closer, this is where we are, right? This is where it is. So if Bitcoin were to make that move, which I don't know if it will or not, right? I'm not really taking a side here. I don't know if it's going to go up to 35K or not. I mean, if it does, that would reach the full extension of the average of the last 2 years. If it were to go up to 35K, then I imagine that ETH or Bitcoin would decisively break down. But if Bitcoin does that, then from a seasonality perspective, it could easily roll over going into the latter part of the year. And that's where Ethereum, Bitcoin might not be able to catch a bid because Bitcoin goes back below its 20-week SMA, right? So that is, I think, is what we're coming into right now, is this idea, well, no matter what Bitcoin does, Ether's valuation against Bitcoin is likely going to go down. If Bitcoin goes up, it breaks Ether off support. If Bitcoin goes down below its 20-week SMA, it could also break Ether off support. Look at what happened back over here, right? So let's go look at Bitcoin USD just a few weeks ago. Remember when Bitcoin closed below its 20-week moving average on the week of June 5th? Overlay Ether Bitcoin onto here, and you will see that it was on this week that Ether Bitcoin put in a new local low, right? That's when it started to collapse. So we're in this, Ethereum's Bitcoin valuation is in this predicament where if Bitcoin pumps, it likely breaks down. And if Bitcoin dumps below the 20-week, then it likely breaks down. Therefore, no matter the direction of Bitcoin USD, the dominance of Bitcoin, you like how I work it in, should go up, right? Yes, crypto Twitter likes to dunk on me anytime it gets a 1 or 2% pullback. But look, guys, I mean, this has just been going up, and it's been going up for a long time. It's been going up for a long time now. And sometimes after you break out, you get sort of a hesitation week where it doesn't really do a whole lot. Arguably, that's what we've sort of been in. But I also think that there's a case to be made that it's likely going to continue breaking out to the upside. And I also think that the collapse of Ether Bitcoin, the collapse of the Ethereum Bitcoin valuation could easily mark the end of the altcoin reckoning that we've been talking about for a long time. If you're unfamiliar with the altcoin reckoning, it's the idea that altcoins are getting wrecked on their Bitcoin pairs for the better part of 2 years after Bitcoin USD peaks. Another way to look at Ethereum is to maybe look at Total 2, which is the altcoin market plus Ethereum. We're gonna look at Total 2. We're gonna subtract out USDT, and we're gonna divide it by the market cap of Bitcoin. And look at this. It broke support already, right? And from the level that it's at right now, to get back to these lows over here, it would still be another 57% drop. Now, this is not just Ether. This is the entire altcoin market plus Ethereum minus the USDT market cap divided by the market cap of Bitcoin. Notice how it goes to parity. Or actually, no, 1.5. It goes about 1.5x or so. It goes up a little over parity, 50% more. But also note that when things get bad, it can come down to about 1/3 of the Bitcoin market cap. When I said parity, what I'm referring to is you take Ether out and it goes to parity. So take Ether out of the equation, the altcoin market tends to go to parity against Bitcoin at the peaks of bull markets, but it also goes down to about 25% of Bitcoin's market cap at the bottom of its bear market. And the altcoin market is still about 40% away from that 25% valuation against Bitcoin. Don't say it can't happen, Okay, it can happen. It's happened before. It can happen again. And as long as liquidity is being drained from the system, I would argue that it will continue likely to be the most. It'll be the most likely scenario in my view. Okay, so where I think we are is we are. Well, I'll say where I am with this. I am in. I'm in this phase where I think that the Ether Bitcoin valuation is likely going to collapse. I don't know exactly when it's going to occur. If I had to guess, I would say it's going to occur this month, right? But I think it started last month. I mean, I even said that May will likely be the last stand for the Ether Bitcoin valuation. June was red. I think July is going to be red too. Arguably, you could argue that it started back in late 2021, right? I mean, it's still been lower highs since that. Whatever you want to call it, right? I mean, we've been following this forever, and it feels like we're in a holding pattern in my view until this breaks one way or the other. Okay, so I think people are placing their bets now. I'm not saying you can't find a bullish case for it. I'm just saying that I more so align with the bearish view on the Ethereum Bitcoin valuation, right? The fundamental idea of changing tokenomics on Ethereum to keep it from collapsing against Bitcoin, to me, it does not have as much merit because it's also comparing it to Bitcoin 4 years ago, when I would also argue that Bitcoin has fundamentally changed over the last 4 years. So there's a lot of things that you have to consider here. A lot of people say that their altcoin isn't going to drop as much as is not going to drop against Bitcoin to its lows this cycle because their altcoin is so much better than it was 4 years ago. Well, Bitcoin's also better than it was 4 years ago. So you're not comparing it to something that's unchanging. You're comparing it to an asset that's growing in adoption every single cycle. So don't compare it to what Bitcoin was 4 years ago. Compare it to what Bitcoin is today, and then we'll talk. So we'll see if it plays out. The receipts are there. If it doesn't play out, then I'll have to hold my hand high and say, look, I was wrong. But all I see, month after month after month, all I see are people keep calling for the flippening when it's just been putting in lower highs. Okay? If the flippening were in the process of occurring, why has the Ether Bitcoin valuation been putting in lower highs since the merge? Ask yourself that. If the tokenomics mattered so much, why is it putting in lower highs since the merge? My view, the market spoke long ago and said that doesn't matter. What matters is liquidity. And yes, at some point, Ether will likely outperform Bitcoin again. It could start as early as this September. In fact, it was last cycle where Ether Bitcoin bottomed out in September of 2019. So you could argue that if Ethereum does collapse against Bitcoin in the next couple of months or so, that could be it for the Ethereum Bitcoin valuation, and maybe it is a higher low. It could easily be a higher low. It does not have to be a revisitation to the 0.01 to 0.02 level. It does not have to be. That's sort of the bullish view. But even in the bullish view, which if you're not familiar with, the bullish view is this idea that the Ethereum Bitcoin valuation is on some type of logarithmic regression type curve, right, where it's still trending higher. I can be amenable to that. I can be amenable to that view. I could potentially agree with that view. I don't know yet, but the point is, if this view is correct, in my mind, it still has to come down here first. If this view is correct. If it's incorrect, then it could still come back down here. But regardless of whether you agree with the bullish view of higher lows or the more bearish view, and the more bearish view being it's just this was the initial capitalization and ever since then it's just an oscillator, right? Whatever you agree with, if you agree with that, if you think one of those two scenarios is the most likely outcome, in either scenario, you still have to go to 0.03 to 0.04 first, right? Whether you believe in the bullish view of it or the bearish view. Where people might disagree is a third scenario that says that the Ethereum Bitcoin valuation does not revisit these levels and it just continues to go higher and flips Bitcoin. I think that is an unlikely outcome. One of the reasons why is when you look at the Ether Bitcoin market cap ratio, we actually got closer to flipping. We actually saw Ether come closer to flipping Bitcoin in 2018 than it did in 2022. And in fact, it got a lot closer back in 2017 than it did in 2018. So if Ether's making progress on flipping Bitcoin, then why is it putting in lower highs? You can also view this just on the Ethereum Bitcoin chart. I mean, this is a high, and then you have a lower high, and then you have a lower high, and then another lower high. So if Ethereum is in the process of flipping Bitcoin, why is it putting in lower highs? The optimist would say it's putting in higher lows, okay? And again, I can potentially get on board with that. But regardless, I still think it has to come back down here first. And if it's down here, then I'll start to look more at the bullish case, and I would actually probably become a bit more neutral on it, right? At that phase, maybe I have a crypto portfolio that incorporates, Bitcoin and Ethereum, as opposed to basically just Bitcoin, right? Because at that point, perhaps it becomes worth the risk in my view. But at this point, I still think it's more likely to bleed back to Bitcoin, just like the altcoin market has, and likely how the altcoin market will continue to do so for at least another 2 or 3 months. Anyways, if you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up, and again, check out the sale on Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. Subscribe again, and I'll see you next time. Bye.